Nuclear weapons and the arms race, and how it affected the Cold War and aggravated it. An annotated bibliography by Leica Dari. First off, we'll start off with the tensions of the Cold War. Now, during the Cold War, tensions between the US and the USSR were extremely high. According to the Nuclear Age, Khrushchev, the USSR's new leader, claimed that war with the capitalist countries was not fatalistically inevitable, meaning that a Soviet war against the Western countries would not necessarily end in disaster and fatalities for the Soviet Union. This pronouncement made capitalist or Western countries extremely wary because it clearly meant that Khrushchev was not hesitant at all about waging war. It seemed as though it was not a question of how, but rather a question of when. Needless to say, tensions between the capitalist countries, specifically the US and the communist countries, specifically the USSR, were extremely high, and everyone seemed to be waiting for war to break out. And to add fuel to the fire, nuclear arms were in the picture for the first time, only worsening the situation. Nuclear arms race. This is an article that had some interesting information. Now, not long after World War II ended in 1945, new hostilities emerged between the US and the Soviet Union. Known as the Cold War, this conflict began as a struggle for control over the conquered areas of Eastern Europe in the late 1940s and continued into the 1990s. The USSR and the US were extremely hostile to one another. Adding nuclear arms to that mix only heightened the hostility. Eventually, this led to the arms race, which can be considered the peak of the Cold War because it was essentially the time in which the Cold War was at its worst. Initially, only the US possessed atomic weapons, but in 1949 the Soviet Union exploded an atomic bomb and the arms race began. As soon as the Soviet Union developed atomic bombs of its own, the entire world was alert to the threat that the tension between these two superpowers now yielded. The USSR had been disadvantaged until then, but then it was an even match, and the US began to worry. It started to struggle to get ahead once again. Both countries continued building more and bigger bombs. In 1952, the United States tested a new and more powerful weapon, the hydrogen bomb. The Soviet Union followed with its own version in 1953. The US worked to get ahead by developing the hydrogen bomb, and for a short while, it was able to rest on its laurels as the more powerful power. But soon after, the USSR caught up and developed its own hydrogen bomb, and the race began. Both countries had embarked on a race, later referred to as the nuclear arms race, to create better, more powerful, and more numerous weapons than the other countries. So they were just at it. The US was creating its arms, and then the USSR was competing to create its own, and they were both trying to get more weapons than the other country, more powerful weapons than the other country, and more destructive weapons than the other country. The fact that this was all in the middle of the Cold War only made it worse. The arms race only heightened the already high tensions of the Cold War. The Nuclear Age quotes. This is a book that had some interesting quotes about the arms race and the Cold War. Khrushchev made a well-publicized threat to use nuclear weapons against England when it launched an attack on Egypt along with France and Israel, after President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal. During this time, the Westerners were always aware that a nuclear attack could happen at any given time. Khrushchev was carelessly threatening the act. Everybody was on end, waiting for when Khrushchev would actually go through with his threats. However, that never happened because Soviets were trying to conceal how weak they really were. Khrushchev's boasts were often given more credence in the West than they deserved. Therefore, the truth of the matter was that the USSR did not have the capability to launch an attack. Yet, the Western countries took the empty threat seriously and therefore continued on with the arms race. The US made more and more weapons, which only worsened the situation of the Cold War. This is an article written by Hanson W. Baldwin in the New York Times back during the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. The United States will have set off 36 nuclear devices, the Russians 3, and the British 1. The figures provide a fairly accurate measurement of our advantage in the nuclear arms race. This is a direct quote taken from a newspaper at the time. So basically, the US was becoming comfortable because it was so far ahead of the other countries, the people in the US were becoming comfortable because they realized that they were so far ahead. Therefore, the USSR was becoming tense at this time and it struggled to catch up to the US, but the US was not expecting it because, as Baldwin says, figures provide a fairly accurate measurement of our advantage in the nuclear arms race. They weren't expecting the Russians to catch up to them. Another quote from Baldwin is that it is comforting to be told that we are possibly 4 years ahead of Soviet Russia in atomic development. Comforting. Baldwin and most of his peers at the time probably believed that because they were 4 years ahead of the Soviet Union, they didn't have anything to worry about. And therefore, the people of the US were taking comfort in the fact, and they weren't prepared for the Soviets to catch up so quickly. And when they did, the US panicked. Another quote from Baldwin after they realized the Soviets caught up was that the vulnerability of our central cities is increasing about 2.5% per year. They were panicking. Essentially, atomic bombs and nuclear weapons create the most destruction in heavily populated or densely populated areas. Most of the countries behind the Iron Curtain, specifically the Soviet Union, is not densely populated. It's such a huge landmass that its population is spread out. So there aren't any specific targets that would cause the most amount of destruction because its population is so spread out. That is not the case in the US. The US had central cities which would be the areas that the Soviets would target because they would create the most destruction. Now, the people were beginning to notice that these cities were increasing in vulnerability about 2.5% per year, and they were worried. The US did not have similar targets in the USSR because the region was so huge and not so densely populated. Like I said, a single bomb from the USSR would hit more people in the US than the same bomb with the same power from the US would hit in the USSR. Therefore, the US was at a disadvantage and wanted to develop its artillery to once again gain a lead from the USSR. Another article done during this time was Eisenhower says Soviets can attack with super bombs. The president told reporters in his 15th news conference that he did not want to give the impression that the Soviet atomic threat was right on our doorstep right this minute. But he did want to give the facts. Essentially, Eisenhower did not want to frighten his people, but he knew that they needed to know the truth. Unfortunately, the truth only served to frighten them, and the public felt more heavily the dangers of the Cold War and the arms race presented. Another quote from Eisenhower is that the Soviets now have the capability of atomic attack on us, and such capability will increase with the passage of time. Eisenhower announced the truth of the situation to his people, and they realized that war was likely. The Soviets were getting more and more powerful, and people already knew how much tension there was between the US and the USSR. Fear increased, and people worried. The Cold War worsened. Another quote from Eisenhower is that the United States government will not disclose the details of its strength in atomic weapons, but it being the Soviet Union, is large and increasing steadily. Eisenhower attempted to keep his people in the dark about the specifics, but there was really no hiding it. The Soviet artillery was large and increasing steadily, and that was the truth. People knew that the Cold War was worsening, and the fact that they knew and the fact that they were frightened was making it even worse. And now the dangers were unfathomable. The nuclear arms race had a terrible effect on the Cold War. This was another novel which had interesting quotes about the situation at the time. According to Anatomy of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Khrushchev was asked to stop testing nuclear arms, he claimed to reply with, "For me to cancel the test would be a crime against our state. I'm sure you know what kind of suffering was inflicted on our people during World War II. We can't risk the lives of our people again by giving our adversary a free hand to develop new means of destruction." This quote suggests that Khrushchev only intended his developments of nuclear arms for defensive purposes. However, his previous threats suggested the opposite. Therefore, the entire world did not know what to believe and was still expectant of a nuclear war. However, now, they were tragically hopeful that there wouldn't be one. On October 16, 1962, following weeks of about what the Russians might be up to in Cuba, Kennedy received word that they were definitely installing nuclear-armed missiles on the island. 90 miles off the U.S. coast. This was soon after the previous claim that Khrushchev made. He made it seem as though he was not planning an attack, but only taking defensive measures. However, providing Cuba with weapons made it clear that that was not the case. People had taken a breath of relief only to have the wind knocked out of them. The arms race and the Cold War were at their worst. A nuclear war or a third world war seemed almost inevitable. The hope that they got from the previous statement that Khrushchev made was shattered. Now, to add fuel to the fire, just a month and a half earlier, in a meeting between the Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin and the president's brother Robert Kennedy, Dobrynin had told Kennedy that the Soviet Union would not give a third country, such as Cuba, the power to involve it in a thermonuclear war. Just before giving Cuba arms, the USSR assured the US that nothing of that sort were to happen. They outright lie caused people to look at the situation in the worst light. There was no doubt about it, in the people's eyes, the USSR was planning an attack on the US. If they weren't, there would not have been any reason to lie so blatantly. So everyone quickly assumed that war was coming. The tensions of the Cold War were worsening as the seconds ticked on. Therefore, it can be concluded that the nuclear arms race made the Cold War exponentially worse. It heightened the tensions and simply worsened an already terrible situation. But the interesting part of it all is that it can also be concluded that the Cold War made the nuclear arms race exponentially worse. There would have been no need for the race at all had the US and the USSR been on good terms. The Cold War and the arms race were interdependent, fed on one another. Without one, the other may not have existed. And essentially, as paradigms go, both were unavoidable due to the other. So this is a list of all of the sources that I cited in my annotated bibliography. The first was Anatomy of the Cuban Missile Crisis by James A. Nathan, which was a book. The second was Now Atomic Artillery by Hanson W. Baldwin, which was an article in the New York Times back in March 24th, 1953. So it was right in the midst of the nuclear arms race and the Cold War. The second was Nuclear Arms Race, which was an internet article from this time. The fourth was Eisenhower Says Soviet Can Attack with Super Bombs by James Reston. This was also in the New York Times later in the same year as Hanson W. Baldwin's article, October 9th, 1953. The last book used was The Nuclear Age, Power, Proliferation, and the Arms Race, which was printed by Congressional Quarterly and also gave some interesting insight into the situation.